All right. Know what you're getting scared at before you do. Don't take my word for it.
I know you always end with the guy next door, so I wanted to tell you about my guy next door. Well, I don't live in that neighborhood anymore, and this was a while ago, but this guy was a wacko. When I was a kid, I used to do a lot of chores around my neighborhood for some of the elderly people who didn't want to do it anymore and could save a few bucks by hiring me to do it. Cutting their lawn, clearing their driveway of snow, raking leaves, shit like that. I usually did 3 houses on the same side of the street that I lived on. I lived in suburban Pittsburgh in a fairly nice neighborhood. We weren't the rich people, but everyone in the neighborhood did all right, and all of the houses and yards were very well taken care of. But the gentleman who lived next to me was an older guy when I was in my early teens, 14 or 15. He had to have been in his mid to late 60s. He lived alone and was kind of the neighborhood curmudgeon. I remember I was 14 or 15 because I got my first job in a restaurant at 16 and stopped doing so many lawns and leaves. So this is where this guy comes into play. The neighbor right next to him, 2 doors down from me, was an older couple in their 70s who would pay me to do all the things that I mentioned. The only things I didn't do or tend to were the gardens, as they were green thumbs and had all kinds of flowers and plants, and they didn't want me messing with those. I don't blame them. Between the houses of the guy next door and them was a strip of land, but they also had a garden running alongside their house. This was one of their only gardens that was mulched, but did not have those barrier things up. And here's where this guy happens into the first part of my story. I was cutting the grass one summer afternoon, and a couple of pieces of mulch had come out of the garden and gotten into the grass. I couldn't really see them, and ran over them with my push mower, and the little pieces shot out across the small piece of grass and hit the guy next door's house. Really, it just hit the foundation, but I think a piece might have hit one of the glass block windows because there was a little tink sound. No damage, no big deal. At least that's what I thought. Oh no. Out comes this fucking wacko screaming and yelling. From around the backyard, he comes through the updated part of his fence holding a steel lawn rake and starts walking right at me, shaking it. I can't really hear him over the mower, so I stopped it and I asked him, "I'm sorry, is there something wrong?" Remember, I'm 14 and this guy is in his 60s. He starts screaming at me about how much of a little shit I am and how I'm going to pay for the damage to his house, and that he knew I had just thrown a rock against it, completely overlooking the fact that there were no rocks there, and I just happened to be cutting the grass, not throwing rocks willy-nilly. I was dumbfounded. The old woman hears what's going on and comes out of her house and is now standing sort of between us, as this guy is shaking his rake at both of us and screaming about suing and how we're absolutely the worst neighbors in the world. She calls for her husband, who again is older and a little bit more frail, and is trying to calm the situation down. This wacko finally swings the rake towards me and the mower that was between us. He just smashed it against the engine on top of the mower. Mind you, this was not my mower. I used the people's 2 doors down. The wife screams. The guy yells, "What the hell are you doing?" And I'm still standing there dumbfounded. Crazy neighbor shakes the rake at me again, says he's calling my parents and that he'll be talking to his lawyer about what he needs to do to sue us. With that, he turns to the side, and as I try to say I'm sorry, he looks at me dead in the eyes and says, "I don't want to hear any of your fucking lip, you little asshole." He stomps back into his yard, shuts the gate, and does not come back out. The nice old couple brought me into their house and called my parents over to tell them what happened. My dad got pissed and immediately went over and started knocking on the curmudgeon's door, but he wouldn't answer it. We all chalked it up to be him having a bad day, and we looked at the mower. There wasn't any real damage to it, maybe just a little scratch. My dad just told Mr. Johnson to take a picture of it and write down what had happened with the exact time and date in case something did come about with the issue down the road. I finished cutting the grass, nothing else happened, until the next day. I was cutting our grass, obviously on the other side of the wacko's house. Now, there was a little bit more land between our houses and a low fence, maybe only about 4 feet high, high enough to keep our 2 corgis in our yard and out of anybody else's. It ran all the way around our house, and there was no way for those dogs to get out. So I'm weed whacking at the edge of the fence on the neighbor's side, and out he comes again. This time he just stands there staring at me, not saying anything. So I just keep my head down, listening to my headphones and doing my job. I'm walking to the back of our yard, just following the fence line with my edge trimmer, when from out of nowhere I feel his presence standing right behind me. I turn around, and he is standing right behind me, with the scariest look on his face, holding up a pair of those scissor-like hedge clippers. He wasn't swinging them around or pointing them at me. He was just holding them up in the air with his hands. I start to freak out inside, and he says to me, "You little asshole, if you let you fucking dogs in my yard ever again, I'm going to nip their tails off." But he didn't do anything other than just stand there. Our dogs could not possibly get over into his yard, and had never even been in his yard. I was scared, and I just looked at him and said, "Okay, I'll make sure they don't." He then says, "You'd better make sure, you little asshole, or I'll be snipping something off of yours and not your tail." He walks back into his house. Okay, yeah, now I am really scared, so I immediately go in to tell my mom, who called my dad at work and told him what happened, and that he needed to talk to this guy when he got home from work. Just like the day before, I finished up my job and then went over to a friend's house for the night for a pool party. So far, I know this sounds a little messed up, but this is where it gets crazier. When I got home from the pool party the next morning, I was in the backyard and noticed a bowl in our backyard in the grass that was not one of ours. It was towards the back down by the fence, down a little hill and bump where you couldn't really see it from the house. I went over to it and immediately knew something was very wrong. There was water in the bowl, but it looked oily on the top. I didn't say anything, I just immediately picked up the bowl and brought it into our garage and set it on a workbench. My dad had gotten up and was finishing his breakfast after his workout, and I asked him if he put a bowl out in the backyard and forgot to dump out whatever was in it. He asked me what I was talking about, and then followed me into the garage where I pointed it out. He immediately knew it was not water, but had antifreeze in it. Now, how did that get in our backyard? And gee whiz, what would have fucking happened if my dogs had gotten into that? We immediately suspected their curmudgeon next door, but there was no way to prove that he had done it. Now, my dad was making his third trip over there in 3 days to talk to this guy, but he would not answer the door, like usual. At this point, my dad called the police and told them everything that had been going on. A cop came over and knocked on the guy's door and then went inside, but that's all we saw. About half an hour later, the cop left and came over to our house to talk with my parents and me. We were standing in our garage with the garage door open, reiterating everything that had happened with the rake and the yard shears and the strange bowl of obviously contaminated water that just showed up in our backyard. While he was standing there talking to us, wacko neighbor comes screaming out of his driveway in his car, and right in front of everyone, nails the throttle, squeals the tires, and takes off down the street at an extremely high rate of speed. The cop leaves us, takes off after him, and I don't know how he did it, but he caught him like 2 or 3 streets up from our house. My brother had come out at this point because of the noise, and we immediately jumped on our bikes to go see what was happening. Turns out, the guy had some pretty serious issues. He was on some really heavy drugs, but was also mixing it with a lot of beer. He apparently was very angry, and the cop told him later that he told him that he was no longer to speak to me without talking to my parents, and he was no longer to threaten anyone in the neighborhood for any reason, and if he did, he would be arrested. But, lo and behold, after talking to the man for a few minutes, the cop realized he was going to be arresting him right then, because he was under the influence of his drugs, and on his way to the store to buy more beer. In a way, I kind of felt sorry for him, because that's a shitty way to live. But the last straw right before we left made me think otherwise. The guy got out and was back home within a day. I didn't hear or see anything of him for like 2 weeks. Well, one morning I was out with my dogs before my dad went to work, and he was just talking with my mother in the kitchen. I didn't realize it, but they were both looking out the window at me while I was playing with my 2 corgis, And my brother came out and we started throwing this ball around. Not a baseball, but it was pretty hard. Every once in a while, my brother would miss it when I threw it towards him, and it would hit our fence and make a loud crack noise. After 4 or 5 of these loud cracks, who can't help himself? Fucking Wacko. He comes raging out of his house, no shirt, just boxer shorts, barefoot, and he's waving his arms and screaming his head off at us to shut the fuck up and keep the noise down. We stand there looking at him, and at this point can no longer take it and just start laughing. What was terrifying me was now making me laugh. I know I shouldn't have done it, but I finally said, "Yeah, and what are you going to do about it, fat ass?" He runs to the side of our fence and starts kicking it and rocking it with his hands, finally breaking a huge piece off. He stepped into our yard, threw it at my brother, and it caught him in the leg and gave him a pretty decent cut. By now, of course, my dad is out there. And I should have mentioned that my dad is an ex-bodybuilder with a very good temper, but knows how strong he is and when he has to use it. He calmly walks over to the old man who is standing there looking like he's going to take a swing, yells for my mother to call the police and then take a look at my brother, and then forcibly started pushing the guy out of our yard. Before he can get back through the piece of fence that he broke, Wacko takes a swing at my dad, who takes a pretty hard one to the left side of his face. But that was that. Dad had had enough. Even though the guy was older and obviously messed up on drugs, my dad dropped the guy with one shot and then basically just sat on him and waited for the police to come. Which is exactly what happened. Long story short, the guy got arrested for everything that he had done, and he was gone for quite a while. I believe he was put into some kind of home for observation, and the only other time that we did see him was when we were packing up to move a couple of months later. I'm sure everyone has a guy like this in their neighborhood, but I'll never forget that fucking clown. I mean, so out of control, and I'm sure mental illness had something to do with it, but not getting any help certainly didn't help him in the long run. We were having Father's Day together just a couple of weeks ago, and that guy came up in conversation. My mother never swears, but all she said was, "What an asshole." Looking back, I was really scared at first, wondering if the guy really was going to do anything. And we're 100% sure that he was the one who put that water with the antifreeze in our backyard. I guess it's not super scary now as I write this all out, but it was at the time, and I remember wondering how far that guy would have gone to hurt me, my family, or my dogs. So, to that old Wacko, wherever you are, let's never meet again. I'm 23 years old and I serve in the U.S. Army. I'm a strong Christian and I have spent the good majority of my life fascinated with the supernatural, as to include angels and demons. When I was younger, around 12 or 14, I wasn't so much a devout Christian. I dabbled in witchcraft, minor spells and rituals, but nothing too serious. It's a black mark on my life I wish I could take back, but it's something nonetheless. And that isn't where it begins. My entire life, I have seen, felt, and heard things others couldn't. I've heard a lot about certain people being spiritually sensitive. I suppose I could be one of those people. I'm not 100% positive I am, but I know I have seen more than any of my close friends or any of my colleagues I've shared my stories with. For the record, I don't believe in ghosts. I believe when a person dies, their spirit goes either to heaven or to hell. There is no in-between, and that's just my personal belief. I do believe demons feed off a person's fears and beliefs, so they may take some type of image as someone deceased. But that again is just my personal belief. I'm just setting a ground basis for my tale. I did the majority of my ghost hunting between 17 and 19. I was bullheaded and dead set on finding something. Something dark. Something scary. I'll quote my mother. Sometimes when you look for something hard enough, you may not find it, but it may find you. In my situation, this couldn't have been truer. I went through the various graveyards, abandoned hotspots, and in Florida in my area there was an old school with severe fire damage called Popash. I believe it's torn down now. We went there and saw nothing extraordinary, a few cold spots, nothing severe. We also went to an old abandoned World War II hospital and only went through the top floor. We had a chair appear in a different spot on the way out than was on the way in, and some cold spots, but again, nothing else. My friends and I, we just kept on getting bolder, braver, less afraid. We got to the point we falsely believed we could storm the very gates of hell and proceed unscathed. My friends, I was very wrong. I have always believed as a Christian, a demon could never physically cause you any pain, could not touch you or harm you, and perhaps they can't. Perhaps I was a special case since I was abusing the thought of, I suppose you would call it, Christian invincibility, against the supernatural at least. Well, one fateful night in the summer of 2005, I was proven wrong. It was a simple night. Pizza, a few friends over just talking about our spooky stories, nothing severe, no Ouija boards or seances, just sitting and talking. What happened next, no one, especially I, could have possibly expected. It began slowly. I felt it tingling through my arms, and then it became hard for me to breathe. I began struggling to inform my friends that something was wrong. My body began to lock up, and by this time they were well aware of something going wrong. What happened next, I'm not going to go into full detail, because in all honesty, it's something I don't like thinking about or talking about. But needless to say, I was put through about 2.5 hours of excruciating pain and fear. I've been to Iraq. I've been shot at. I've had IEDs go off on my convoy, and nothing to this day has scared me or hurt me as much as what happened that night. I know my description may seem vague, but believe me, the things I saw in my head and the pain I felt, it's hard to describe. Apparently, my friend's account of this experience included them calling my youth pastor at 2 a.m. to come help, holding my hands to keep me from gouging out my eyes, and they were praying like their lives, or more correctly, my life, depended on it. The weeks following, I felt unsafe, very afraid every day I went back into my room. Crosses I had always hung up on my walls always seemed to be either upside down or off the wall completely. I was plagued by nightmares of the things I saw. It was a very dark time, and I continued to pray for deliverance, and in time everything stopped. Was this a punishment for the things I'd done and the occult I dabbled in? Probably. But believe me, friends, the hell I experienced in that time was awful, and let my story be a warning. Do not mess with anything if you cannot handle the consequences that may come to follow. Take my story as whatever you like. Blow me off like I'm a nut, as I'm sure many of you will. But for any of you that have begun down the road I once walked, trying to live both in the light and the dark, reconsider your choices.